part 1 of this series, I am going to make this cockpit look busy. I'm also going to make these exhausts look nasty in a good way. Since this is Miniart's first kit, I was both excited and nervous. The cockpit tub did need some work for it to be able to fit. It does have different locating tabs and everything, but they just would not snap together as you would expect with some other manufacturers. But once you kind of trimmed it down, then it fit well. I decided to go with ArtScaleKit's fantastic 3D printed seat. Also comes with some seat belts, but we'll talk about that later. Now, before I put on my green, what I did is I laid down a base coat of aluminum, and then I just used some off-the-shelf hairspray to be able to use my hairspray chipping technique that will come later. So I decided to go with Tamiya LP31, which I think looks pretty dang close to the cockpit colors for some of the references, but it looks like they varied quite a bit when it comes to the color that they put in the cockpits. So now for the fun part, hairspray chipping. Now, I'm not a master at this, but basically what it comes down to is you're going to have a layer of hairspray in between your paint layers that's going to be attacked by water that you put over the top layer. So as I'm putting on water on top of the paint, it'll seep through and get down to the underlying layers, and that will then let the paint kind of flake off. Now there's a few additions that you can do to this. You can see it's a little bit resistant at the moment for anything. So what I can do is I can also take something sharp and kind of get it started. You can also scrape away a little bit of just the top layer. Use a 2500 grit sanding sponge if you want to just more use some kind of abrasion rather than a scratch or a complete flake off. Now there's definitely an art to this. You want to make it so that it's not just one big chunk that just flies off, but actually look like, feet have been rubbing up against that and abrading off all of the paint coming off of it. So with it, you don't want to just have some big paint flakes coming off. You want to have some scratches, some places where it's worn down a little bit. You'll see me replicate this here, but your references are going to play a pivotal role in what you're going to aim for achieving. So here's a good example of replicating paint chipping away by chipping away at the paint. I'm just using something sharp, either a needle from an airbrush or an X-Acto knife, and just kind of scraping at a few raised edges, things that should be normally abrading, right? You can also do a 2500 grit sanding sponge like I was talking about and get more of that abrasion look. We'll do the same method on the sidewalls as well. Just trying to use either something that's sharp like an X-Acto knife or a needle out of an airbrush, something sharp that we can just make some fine scratches to it. Just try to pick out the high points on there, because those are generally what's going to get abraded, right? And get worn a little bit faster. But also add some scratches in there. If you're not sure exactly what it should look like, always look at your references like I just said. With each of these processes, the whole cockpit is starting to come alive. So I believe the technical term or name for this brush is a deerfoot stippler, but really all you got to do is just go down the craft aisle and you should see something similar to this. It's just a really crappy paintbrush. Now the ArtScaleKit seat comes with some really nice seat belts, and they're actually made by HGW, and they're amazing looking. However, very tedious. You got to actually loop through everything, through all the turnbuckles and everything, all the buckles. And after a couple nights, it was just a nightmare. So I decided to go in with the Quinta set, where this is very easy. So right now, what we got to do is remove all those details, because we got the seat belts, might as well use everything else in the kit. Now the Quinta instrument panel is pretty amazing. There's a lot of really fine detail to it, but the Miniart set is not a bad set. You get individual decals for each of the dials, or one big sheet, and it's got a lot of the little placards to it, so there is a lot that just comes right out of the box. But the Quinta set does add just a little bit more authenticity to show that it's a busy cockpit. Now, normally what you would want to use with these decals to apply them is some PVA glue, but I was lazy, had some CA glue, so I just used some black CA glue. Definitely use at your own risk. I have ruined a project before because I glued Quinta seatbelts to my finger. And as you rip that off your finger, so comes all of the detail, and it looks atrocious, and you have to go buy a whole new set. So please just learn from my mistake. To bring out all the details, I'm just using Agrax Earthshade Citadel shader wash, whatever you want to call it. Works really good at bringing out all the details, and works as a good overall wash for certain areas like a cockpit where you just want to enhance and flow into some different crevices. And with this, if it ever becomes a bit too stark, which in some areas it looks a little bit too thick, just come with some Windex and clean it up afterwards. Now, since gravity is a thing, I am putting a pretty hefty wash on the floor of the cockpit, because that's where all the feet are going to be rubbing against, all the dirt and everything. And even if you look at some museum aircraft, outside looks gorgeous, but then you get a peek in the actual cockpit, and you notice they don't have very much volunteers that clean the inside of those cockpits. So the seatbelts, they look great, but a little bit too factory fresh. So that same Agrax Earthshade from Citadel applied over that, and then all the details make it look like it has a lot more depth to it and makes it look a bit more natural. Now, first you can see it's kind of a bit puddling in different areas, and it's maybe a bit too thick. So what you can do is you can move it around. You'll have a little bit of time to be able to kind of place just the right amount to get the right effect. If you ever have too much, you can either wick it away or thin it by using Windex once again. Now, keep in mind, this stuff does not work like a oil wash or enamel wash or anything like that. It's going to cure fairly fast, and it's going to be stuck there. You can use some Windex, like I've been saying, to kind of wash it and thin it and remove it, but you have to work pretty fast. If you use the Windex later and too late, it's going to come off in chunks. One last look before we say goodbye to the cockpit as we put it into the fuselage and hide some of these details from ever seeing the light of day again. So the good thing with this step is Miniart has some locating tabs that you can then put the cockpit, line them up nice and properly. For closing it together and getting it to line up can be a little bit tricky, but there is a little bit of a trick. Since we haven't put on the engine, what you can do is you can get it as close as you can and then look down and then kind of manipulate it with your finger and move it around so it then clicks into place. And then once you're there, it is pretty solid and a satisfying click just about happens. Now on to the glue sniffing portion of this build. Cockpit is still looking pretty busy. It's a good thing we have the different variation in there with the different seat belts and the different metal showing through and all the different red handles to add some variation to it. Otherwise it turns into this weird dark green void. Now it's a little bit tricky to see on here, but there's a lot of seam lines when it comes down to the exhaust pipes, so we'll have to go in and sand them out. Now the engine goes together pretty nicely. There's a few weird pipes with bending angles where it has to go around corners and you have to kind of manipulate them in place, but otherwise went together pretty easily. We're gonna add some ignition wiring to this. Since the face of the engine and the nacelle is pretty exposed, we want to dress it up as much as possible. It's not like a FW190 where it might be hidden and all that. So I'm just using solder. You can use some lead wire, but it's like $4 for hundreds of feet of this stuff, and it's pretty easy to find. So that's what I use. For each of these holes, you'll have to then drill the hole. They give you a little bit of a guide of where they need to be. And also with the instruction manual in the end, they actually show you where all those wires need to be added. So I thought that was a pretty neat addition to the instruction manual that I didn't have to go research myself. And with this, you can kind of see how the wiring goes. It'll go from the ignition coil up in the front to then go through the cylinder head piece and then back out and then up through whatever that mount thing is, and then all the way back to the front is the way that I had that wired. And you're going to repeat this process about 18 times because the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, that's a mouthful, had 18 cylinders. The cool thing with Miniart is they've molded the ignition harness pretty well to where you know where the wires need to go. And then you add that to the diagram that they also include and it makes it a lot easier to figure out where everything needs to go. Now to add a wash. So I'm using Citadel Null Oil shade and I'm just applying it just pretty liberally to there. If I ever put too much on, I can wick it away or I can use some Windex. And definitely sorry about the blurriness. My new camera that'll be in the next part is much better at the autofocus. And this is the point where you'll notice that my exhaust is super shiny. I don't know what reference I was looking at or what. Maybe because I was thinking how the super turbo works in this, that those wouldn't really get cruddy. Well, they do, and don't worry, we'll be fixing that in a sec. When it comes to the firewall, oh, these get super gruddy. So this time I'm using that Agrax Earth shade to kind of give it that brown, kind of grungy, greased up look. Now, whether or not this detail will ever see the light of day again, I don't know. Maybe if you look really close on the finished piece, you'll be able to see this, but I know it's there. Now these engine mounts scare the hell out of me. They are pretty small. I don't know if they're accurate to the real thing, But man, if they are, I can imagine that double WASP engine would just rip itself apart. I don't know what is truly holding it on to the frame. It's kind of interesting. Maybe the piping is most of the structure. I don't know. I'm gonna have to look at some diagrams. But for whatever reason, with the kit, you just have some really small attachment points. I'm locking them in place with some super glue and accelerating it. And I just hope and pray that the engine does not come off, because I'm not going to be putting on the nacelles. I want to have this an exposed engine. So I'm starting to get the feeling that anything that is cylindrical on this kit, I'm probably going to have plenty of cleanup. So for these oil coolers, yep, more seems to be filed away that maybe will never ever be seen again, but whatever. I cleaned them up and attached the photo etch part supplied with the kit. So now the part you've been waiting for, we're gonna dirty up those pipes. So I've got a set from Vallejo that comes with a bunch of different rust colors, and we're starting out with a chocolate brown, the color from Vallejo. So we're having that be kind of our base layer. And rather than take the whole thing apart, I'm trying to see if I can just paint those pipes with it still assembled. So now I'm adding some Vallejo light rust that's heavily thinned down and just putting them into a couple of strategic areas. Now for some Vallejo orange brown, and we're just going to put them into a couple random areas, and then we're going to attack it with a sponge and just kind of tap it before it dries, so it kind of creates that splotchy look where you get with rust, where it's not uniform, but you kind of just get it pigmented here and there. Now to add some of our favorite Nuln oil from Citadel, just let that kind of pool around all the different raised edges, and it's going to give it just a perfect shadow. Works really, really well for this. And if you think you have too much, once again, you can use Windex or window cleaner, or whatever you call it, something with ammonia. It'll be able to attack that. So it's really a process of add some, take some away, until it looks just the way you want it to. Now it's looking pretty good, but not quite there. We're going to employ my secret weapon. Got an old bottle of pigments from Wilder. This is old grease, and especially if you have that wash that's still a little bit wet, it'll stick to it really well and gives this really nice grungy look to the pipes where oil and grease have just kind of caked on and flung to it. At this point, there might be a little bit too much, so I'm using mineral spirits to just kind of move it around and kind of turn it more into a wash, and so it'll just stay off of the high points and move towards the crevices. On some parts, we'll want to replicate some fresh engine oil that's been on there. And so we're using the aptly named product from MIG, Fresh Engine Oil Wash. So putting that in and just putting into just a few strategic places where maybe that oil would stick. Seams. Why did it have to be seams? Actually, this kit's pretty good when it comes to cleaning up the seams, but we will need to attack a few certain points on here because we're going to make this into a natural metal finish, and any sort of ghost seam is going to show up super prominently on there. I'm using just rubberized CA, putting it into each of those crevices, letting it kind of soak in, and put it into anywhere. Looking at the bottom, plenty to work with seams. So we have a little bit of seam in that joint that we'll have to deal with, where especially it didn't go together super cleanly. That's my bad. But because otherwise the fit was really good with the cockpit tub and everything once you got it in there. Once the glue's cured, now we're going to do some sanding. As you can see right here is a little bit of a tight space to be able to sand these, and these ammo sanding sticks are amazing for that. Comes in a bunch of different grits. I'm going to first start with 240 and work my way up to some higher grits until that area is polished. I'm using one of the new AK paint markers. They work really well for this. The red, as you can see, isn't really red, so I'm using it for this, where I'll use a redder red paint for red stuff. We'll know that we've sanded enough when all of that red paint is completely gone. Now on the bottom, I can go in, I can use my big Infinity sanding sponges, and it'll make quick work out of these seams. Starting out with the 400 grit and then just working my way up higher to about 1500 grit, so it looks all nice and polished and ready to go. I'll change to the rubber black pen, and just to check out my seams, you can see that there are a few areas that still need some work. Looking pretty good, but a little bit more work is needed. We sanded away all of our detail, we got to restore it. Normally what I'd like to do is get like a razor saw or something like that, and then deepen the engraved details, and then also take like an old airbrush needle and poke the holes deeper in each of the rivet lines. But you know, I didn't do that on this, so now I have to completely scribe them from scratch. Thing that's going to help a lot is this blueprint that I took from a modeling magazine. It's going to tell me exactly where I need to put all these little rivets and restore each panel line. That's it for this part. In the next part, I'm going to be laying down some paint, prepping for some metallic finishes. and getting this to look like one cool, shiny, metallic bird.